What if I told you that a country, one of Europe's cradle of civilization, effectively sold its own future for short-term gains? That the Allies meant to rescue it became, in many ways, its jailers? That the crisis that shattered lives in Athens holds warnings for the rest of us even today? That might sound like hyperbole. But by the end of this video, I want you to see the Greek debt crisis not as a purely Greek failure, but as a cautionary drama about the seductive promise of borrowed prosperity, the dangers of losing fiscal control, and how powerful institutions can twist from saviors into enforcers. We'll peel back the layers startling and hidden of how Greece went from borrowing paradise to austerity hell. We'll follow the story from its roots, through the crash, the painful fixes, and the lingering consequences. And in our final act, we'll draw urgent lessons and ask, could something like this happen again, somewhere else, possibly even to a country you care about? So lean in, let's begin.
Setting the stage, background, stakes, and teasing the twists. To understand how Greece sold its future, we need to see how the stage was built. The political choices, the blind faith, the hidden accounting, and the structural constraints. Along the way, a twist. Greece didn't fail only because of overspending. It failed because of an institutional mismatch between a democratic state and a monetary union without full control over its own currency. Here are key elements to hold in mind. Euro membership. When Greece entered the euro, it surrendered monetary tools, currency devaluation, independent rate setting that many crisis-hit nations have relied on. That constraint would later become a trap. Structural distortions, chronic tax evasion, oversized public sector demands, weak productivity, patronage politics, creative accounting, and statistical opacity. For years, Greece masked the real size of its deficits and debt exposure through off-balance sheet deals and questionable swaps. External creditors and conditionality. Once Greece's crisis exploded, powerful external parties, the European Central Bank, European Commission, IMF, would impose harsh terms. A turning point twist. The moment Greece's debt became not just unsustainable, but unmanageable, and its sovereignty constrained. Over the next sections, we'll trace how each of these pieces stacked up, and how one by one, contingencies turned into inevitabilities. Origins. The long road to debt accumulation. Post-war and structural vulnerabilities. Greece's debt problems did not begin in 2009. In fact, some historians trace Greek public borrowing as far back as the mid-20th century. But the real acceleration occurred from the 1980s onward. After the fall of the military junta and return to democracy, Greek governments pursued social spending expansions, welfare, pensions, subsidies, as a means to consolidate political legitimacy. Public sector salaries and pensions grew rapidly. Meanwhile, revenues never kept pace, fueled by a large informal economy, pervasive tax evasion, and weak administrative enforcement. Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio, manageable in earlier decades, began to balloon. By the 1990s, it was already breaching EU criteria: 60% debt, 3% deficits. In fact, Greece violated the Maastricht Treaty's debt and deficit rules long before it formally joined the euro, sometimes by masking deficits or using currency swaps with banks to hide debt. Joining the euro. Confidence, cheap credit, and complacency. When Greece joined the euro in 2001, something curious happened. The risk premium vanished. Investors assumed that Greece now had the backing, implicitly, of the eurozone, and that default was unlikely. Bond yields plunged to levels comparable to Germany. This cheap funding environment created a false comfort zone. Greece could borrow heavily at low rates and roll over debt without much difficulty. But the structural vulnerabilities were still there, just hidden behind safe euro yields. The 2008 collapse's trigger, the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, served as the catalyzing shock. Suddenly, capital markets grew wary, credit dried up, growth sagged. For a country with high debt burdens, weak growth, and chronic structural deficits, the slip was steep. By late 2009, Greece's newly elected government, Prime Minister George Papandreou, revealed that the fiscal deficit was 12.7% of GDP, twice the level previously disclosed, blindsiding markets. This revelation shattered confidence. Ratings agencies began downgrading Greek debt. This was the moment the house of cards began to come apart. Rise toward crisis, escalation, and fragile stabilization. 2009 to 2010, from revelation to bailout. Once markets smelled trouble, lenders demanded much higher yields for Greek bonds, or refused them outright. Greece's borrowing costs began to soar relative to Germany. In late 2009 and early 2010, Greece attempted austerity measures and structural reforms to restore confidence, but the scale of the funding gap was too great. By April 2010, Prime Minister Papandreou requested a rescue from the Eurozone and IMF. In May 2010, Greece signed the first economic adjustment program, bailout, to receive about €107 billion over multiple years, under strict austerity and reform conditions. The rescue came with rules: cuts to pensions, public sector salaries, tax hikes, privatizations, imposed by external lenders in exchange for cash. But those measures themselves would deepen recessionary pressures, reducing tax revenues and making debt ratios worse. That is the classic austerity paradox. 2010 to 2012. The downward spiral. Rather than stabilizing, the Greek economy crashed deeper. GDP shrank, unemployment soared, and social unrest exploded. By 2012, unemployment peaked near 28%. In March 2012, Greece enacted a massive debt restructuring, private sector involvement, PSI. Bondholders agreed to a so-called haircut, writing off about 75% of the value of their Greek holdings. This was the largest sovereign default restructuring in history at that time. Yet, even after the debt haircut, Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio remained terrible because GDP had collapsed so deeply. The country was burdened with debt levels well above 150 to 180% of GDP, making any recovery incredibly difficult. Meanwhile, the institutional role of the Troika, European Commission, ECB, IMF, solidified. They weren't just lenders. They were now dictating Greece's fiscal and structural policies. A twist: the rescue force was now the enforcer. 2012 to 2015. The Cyprus drama and bank holiday Greece limped on through further austerity programs, the second economic adjustment program. But political backlash intensified. In January 2015, Alexis Tsipras's left-wing party Syriza won on a platform of repudiating further cuts. In the summer of 2015, tensions peaked. Greece failed to make an IMF repayment on time, becoming the first developed country to do so in modern times. Banks closed for weeks, capital controls were introduced, and a referendum rejected the EU's bailout terms, only for the government to return and accept nearly identical terms under duress. That's a dramatic twist. The assertive rejection of austerity gave way to capitulation. Cyprus signed the third economic adjustment program meanwhile, 2015 to 2018. This final bailout imposed further structural reforms and budget surplus commitments, even as Greece remained under intensive supervision by its creditors. Breaking point: when the country sold its future. What is the selling of a future? It's when a country cedes meaningful policy space, constrains its sovereignty, and sacrifices growth potential to meet debt obligations. Loss of policy tools. Because Greece was inside the euro, it lacked the ability to devalue its currency to restore competitiveness, set its own interest rates or liquidity policy to ease burden, monetize debt, print money in extreme cases. These tools are often how countries recover from debt crises. Greece had none of them. It was boxed in. Sovereign constraint under the Troika. The Troika demanded not just budget cuts, but structural reforms, labour market deregulation, pension overhaul, privatisation of public assets, liberalisation of services. Some of these measures clashed with local norms, institutions, and capacities. To keep receiving tranche payments, Greece had to submit to external audits and approval. In effect, Greece lost partial sovereignty over its budget. That's the sale of the future. The social and human costs. From 2008 to about 2013, Greece lost about 860,000 jobs, with only approximately 240,000 recovered afterward. European data journalism.eu public spending fell more than 25% in real terms. Health, education, infrastructure all retreated severely. The demographic impact was also stark. More than 1 million Greeks emigrated. These weren't just numbers. Entire generations' opportunities were lost. Neighbourhoods hollowed. Young people left. The promise of prosperity receded. Fallout, the long shadow and structural stagnation, partial exit and lingering constraints. In August 2018, Greece officially exited the third bailout program, but the terms of the exit were extraordinary. Greece would have to run budget surpluses through 2060 just to service its debt. It remained under European supervision and had limited room to deviate from agreed paths. Some legacy regulations, on privatisations, labour law, fiscal rules, remained as conditions. Even years later, debt ratios remained shockingly high, well over 150% of GDP, making Greece the most indebted nation in the Eurozone by ratio. Recovery, but fragile. Yes, Greece has seen modest growth, regained some capital market access, and slowly brought down unemployment from its peak. But many signs suggest structural fragility. Growth is low, and return to former income levels is painfully slow. Many younger Greeks never returned or never entered the labour market. Public investment is weak. The burden of debt service still sucks away fiscal flexibility. In 2025, Greece announced plans to repay early part of its first bailout loans, potentially a decade ahead of schedule. Reuters. That suggests both growth confidence and a desire to reduce dependence, but also underlines how long the hangover has lasted. Failed fixes, reforms that didn't stick, and structural constraints through the 2010s, multiple attempted fixes were deployed. Austerity measures, government spending cuts, tax hikes, structural adjustment, debt restructuring, the PSI haircut, privatisations, selling state assets to raise capital, labour and pension reform, reducing rigidities, institutional reform, trying to fix tax collection, governance, statistical transparency. Yet many of these fixes failed or underperformed because austerity deepened recession and shrank the base on which revenues could recover. Privatisations fetched less than hoped and often sold to foreign players, producing public backlash. Reforms ran into political resistance, institutional inertia, and weak enforcement. The debt burden remained so high that even successful reforms would struggle to make a dent. In other words, you can't repair a structure while pulling its foundation out from under it. Connecting to modern parallels. Echoes, warnings, and shocking data. Greece may seem like an extreme case, but elements of its story echo elsewhere. Today, debt burdens rising globally. After the 2008 crisis, and now compounded by the pandemic, sovereign debt levels have surged worldwide. Some nations are flirting with the boundaries of sustainability. The Greek crisis is a cautionary trail map for what can go wrong when debt becomes structurally entrenched rather than cyclically manageable. Eurozone and currency union constraints. Any country in a fixed exchange system or monetary union without currency control faces similar risk. Lack of monetary flexibility, dependence on external institutions, and inability to relieve debt with inflation or devaluation. Structural rigidities, tax evasion, and governance crises. Many emerging economies have weak tax bases, corruption, informal sectors, echoing Greece's structural flaws. Their ability to respond to debt stress may be similarly compromised. Austerity backlash and social fracture. When you slash spending in recessions, the political backlash is severe. Greece's social protests, emigration, and generational scars are not unique. Countries across the world see these risks if they impose draconian cuts without growth strategies. Data echo, debt to GDP ratios, yields, and demographics. At its worst, Greece's debt to GDP soared near 180%. Council on Foreign Relations. Between 2008 and 2013, domestic demand shrank over 30%. European data journalism.eu population decline. More than 1 million left Greece between 2008 and 2013-2018, especially young people. European data journalism.eu. These figures are painful. But they also show how deep a debt crisis can scar a society. If a country today faces, say, 120% debt, stagnation, political gridlock, or binding constraints, the Greek path shows how swiftly things can spiral. 3 clear takeaways. As you digest this story, here are 3 lessons to carry forward. 1. Borrowing is not a free lunch, especially for sovereigns. When debt is used, not for growth-enhancing investment, but for current consumption, it becomes a liability. Without careful discipline, it compounds until it overwhelms. 2. Sovereignty costs matter. If you hand away key policy tools, monetary flexibility, currency control, independent central banking, you limit your capacity to respond when shocks hit. Greece's Euro membership was both a blessing and a binding trap. 3. Policy fixes must respect structural limits and real economy dynamics. Quick cuts, forced reforms, and external control may look like solutions, but if they ignore human impacts, political constraints, institutional weaknesses, they backfire. Debt restructuring must go hand in hand with growth-oriented investment, public legitimacy, and institutional reform. A warning or an open-ended thought. Greece did not end this story cleanly. Even today, parts of its future remain pledged to debt. The social scars remain visible. And the question remains, how many other countries are walking similar high-wire debts, steadying themselves through financial illusions until a shock might topple them? Consider this. If a country with 100% debt to GDP, slow growth, or deep structural distortions faced a sudden credit squeeze, could it slip into its own Greek-like crisis? Could it lose control over its own agenda and be forced to sell its future? The Greek debt crisis is not just a historical case. It is a lasting warning. Call to action. If you found this story enlightening, I invite you to share this video with someone who might benefit. A student, a policymaker, anyone curious about how modern economics interweaves with politics and human lives. Comment below. What parallels do you see elsewhere? Which country worries you the most when you imagine the next crisis? Subscribe for more deep dive videos where we pull apart the hidden structures behind financial dramas, systemic risk, and the forces that bind nations.